Welcome back to another Pen Talk. Thanks for tuning in. This is going to be a little bit of a return to nostalgia, a return to my videos of yore, which I talked about doing Franken pens and utilizing some of the many parts that I've been fortunate enough to collect and making pens out of them. So in going through one of my boxes, I came across this pen. It was highly oxidized, so this looked black. So I've done what I call, a second level polish. I leave some of the oxidation in there, which I think shows up the chasing. There appears to be some very worn or very minimal amount of three-letter initials there in the little engraving box. I've cleaned and flushed and did everything here, but what really got my attention to this pen is the nib. So that just opens up very, very nicely with very little pressure. So to quote Wesky Squirrel, this could be approximating a wet noodle, but I don't think it's quite there, but it's certainly a very full flex type of nib. I put on a number 15 sack because this is a small barrel, and this is not going to hold a lot of ink, which, considering I think this nib is going to put out a lot of ink, it's not going to write for very long, but that's one of the trade-offs with vintage, especially a smaller pen like this. I used a little bit of permanent wood glue, which is not going to affect either the ebonite or the sack. And then after that dries, I put on a coat of shellac over top of it. And I find that gives me a nice permanent attachment to that sack. And this is the cap that I found that fit because the pen did not have a cap on it. This is that nice wood grain Waterman ebonite from the early 20s, and this came up and polished up very nicely, and it threads very, very well onto this Moore body. So I'm always impressed about how I can take parts from different pens and put them together. I think this color combination is starting to grow on me, but it's not my favorite. So we're going to insert the sack, put some talc on it, go through a little bit of a process, and then see if this nib will perform as I expect it to. You may ask yourself, the Moore Pen Company? Well, that was what I'm going to be calling a Tier 2 pen manufacturer. Tier 1 are your Schaefer, Parker, Wall Eversharp, Watermans. Tier 2 were companies that tried to compete with Tier 1. And then I've done videos on Tier 3, which were basically the lower end pens that, may have looked creative or done other things, but the pen companies didn't stay around long, and many of them were just kind of like pop-up companies. So here's some examples of some Moore pens that I have in my collection. Not all of them, but some of them. So this is one of their classic designs, flat top. They like this little nib design. A classic lever fill. You uncap it, you unscrew it, and then we have more nib, similarly labeled to the one that we have in the silver version, the Franken one that we're working on. But as we go through this, I think you'll see that it may be more Franken than what I thought. Here's an example of a more metal overlay pen. Yeah, another classic lever fill with your little ring at the top for hanging around your neck. Unscrews easily, and this also has a very similar type of nib to what we've had before. This is a number 2. It's also kind of stubbish, which is nice. And all of them were, this is not kind of just soft, but not really flexible nib. Then we go into these Model 94s, which I just enjoy. I enjoy Art Deco design. I enjoy how the 20s and 30s exemplified that and showed up in fountain pens, and just a great celluloid here. The way they have those rings engraved in the cap band. Here's it in a different color. We got nice sunlight, so that should be coming across well. And here's that pen in black. One of these, the things that these pens have in common is they went to a different style nib. They called it a Manaflex nib, which I think is a strange combination of manifold, which is generally considered to be a very stiff nib, and a flexible nib. These are, I wouldn't really call these flexible, kind of like what we saw before. They're a little soft, and this pen also has that visible window in, which Schaefer did for a while. This is just paint, as you can see, is coming off in places. So this pen was a daily writer for me for a couple months, and I enjoyed it, and it was very reliable and worked well, and I enjoyed the feel of the nib on paper. So you may say, I recognize that celluloid. Well, here's another example from another, kind of like tier 1.5 is Conklin. And this is towards the later stages of Conklin. This is not made at all to the same quality level as the Moore pen. You know, this is a very nice stylized clip, heavily gold plated, or could be even gold filled because they've held up well, they polish up well, where the Conklin looks like it kind of just has like a nickel or a steel, nothing really plated there. But these did have very nice nibs, which to me made them a good buy and a good find. It's a cushion nib. I've done some reviews on this pen, but again, very nice design, nice smiley face on it. So to me, one of the great aspects of vintage is that variety that you have. I love restoring them. I love bringing back these old pens, and you know, Wasky Squirrel might like some of these black versions because they're very simplistic in design, and this one is still black. It hasn't turned green. That I polished up the Franken pen. So those of you that may not be familiar with sterling silver, heavily oxidized, here's an example of it in this Waterman safety pen. And I find this cleans up very nicely with my polishing pads, and sometimes I'll use some polishing paste. With filigree like this, I probably won't use any paste, but just to give you an example of what it looked like then and what it looked like after being polished. You know, silver is a great material like gold. There's a reason why it was valued and prized and costly during most of man's history, because of its unique qualities, and especially from an aesthetic viewpoint. That chasing came out nice in that Moore pen. So after digging out my vintage Moore pens and looking at this one a little bit more closely, I've decided that the only thing more about this pen is the nib. There's some vague remnants of the word sterling with the hallmark here at the bottom of the barrel on that overlay, but more would have been more heavily labeled, like this one is here. It says it's, you know, rolled gold, and it just doesn't have the same feel and look. You know, it's substantial. It's definitely not a low-end barrel the way it's made, but I don't think it has any of those trademarks that I expect with a Moore pen. But considering back in those days the variety of pens that were made and things, it could well be a Moore pen, but I've not been able to validate that through my research. And this is a beautiful chased pattern, and this just cleaned up with a light polish. It's been sitting in my collection for probably well over 30 years, so it's amazing how these things clean up. So the nib on the black pen is, I think, in the same family. It is fairly soft, but it's not quite as soft, so that I'm putting about twice as much pressure to get it to spread, not quite as much as I can with the nice nib on that silver version. Went through to get the nib on the silver Franken pen to work. I took a more closely look at these two pens, which are basically the same pen, made in probably the same period of time, and have the same nib on it, but these nibs are seated differently. So we have some strange light coming in. And, you know, these pens I would probably pop out that feed, pop out the nib, you know, really clean them out, do a good job with them, and then reseat them so they're, you know, I think this one here is more seated the way I think it should be, and this one is certainly out further, and there's a bigger distance between the feed and the nib, but maybe the person who had this pen wanted a dry writer, and that's definitely one way of making it write drier, is giving a longer flow path for the ink. So after doing what I normally do to restore a vintage pen, I inked the pen up and it wouldn't write. So I looked at the nib and the tines were severely misaligned. As you can see, there's still a little bit of a difference in the curvature between those two tines, but I think I've aligned them. They got good gapping. So we're gonna put the nib back in and see if the writing is improved, or do I have to even work more on reforming the nib to get it to contour better with the feed. But it is a beautiful looking nib, nice long tines. Classic vintage nib. So you might ask what I use to work on the nib. So this is an acrylic form. This also comes in metal, but it's quite more expensive in metal, and some people do prefer metal, but you can put the nib on here and find where that contour is what you want, and then form, you know, the metal to hopefully follow that contour. And you can do, here's convex, here's concave, so you can work on both sides of the nib and hopefully get the contour correct. So there's no real instructions, at least I haven't bothered to look up real instructions, but I use this nice sturdy wooden stick. It's like a cuticle stick. I think it's nice to use because it's soft, so it's not going to mark the metal. So I use this to put pressure on the nib to form it and to try to get it to follow the contour of these cones that are in this block of plastic. And this is also a classic vintage feed. You know, 3 good sized channels. There's a lot of ink that can flow through there, and no fins. You know, very similar to the spoon feed, but the Watermans generally, you know, were not quite as wide as this. So this one should have good flow, which is when I did the flush, there was a good flow through the nib and feed. So hopefully with the reformed nib, it will write now. So now for the real test, how is it going to write? So I have to be happy that I was able to get it to write, because my pen experiences recently have not been as easygoing as I like them to be. But that's the fun part about fountain pens, is you really got to focus and pay attention, and especially trying to bring back a vintage pen that probably had some abuse during its age, and now it can write. And I'm actually growing to like this silver combo with the wood grain cap, gold band. So gold and silver certainly are two nice metals. You know, it uncaps a little less than 1 turn, which is nice. Lengthwise, it fits well in the hand. I mean, that's a small section, typical of minty vintage pens. And, you know, my theory is originally, you know, people were writing with quills, so that was very, very small. And I think this was probably a preferred size. It is a attractive pen, so let's see if it's worth our adulation. I'm happy. I mean, compared to what it was before, this is a vast improvement. Occasionally we need to take phone calls. So one of the things that's nice, and I'd let the pen set for about 3 or 4 minutes. As you can see, it just took a little bit of time to get that ink flow going. So I'm happy now with how this nib works. I mean, it is extremely soft, and it's very easy to get some interesting line variations. You're going to hear a little bit more scratchiness when you push the pen, but you know, I guess I could try to smooth in between the tines a little bit, but I'm happy with that. I mean, I'm not going to be, you know, pushing it all the time. And to me, this is a semi-noodle. We'll make up a new term. And the reason why I mentioned that, I mean, that's a pretty much an extra fine line, and that's pretty much almost 2 millimeters. So that's an incredible spread. So we're spreading from about 0.2 to approximately 2.0 millimeters. So I put this together, a pen for a new pen person I met in DC. So we're going to share this video and see if it's a pen that they like. I'm certainly happy with it. For those that need to post their pens, this does post. It makes for an extremely long pen. But if you need to put the cap someplace, you can do that. You know, I'll just put it on the side. Again, posting on metal is not something I think we all want to do on a regular basis. This is my first writing with nib, which I like, but I wasn't happy with the way the color was coming out, because the gold Antigua should be a lighter color. So after writing with the pen for a lot longer, the ink color changed, and we're going to show you that. Other people are much better at doing that than I am. But, you know, this is more the color of this ink that I'm used to. And even though I flushed this feed and cleaned it as well as I could, it still took a while for whatever residue ink, which was probably a black ink or whatever, to finally get flushed out with the ink that I put in. And now I like it. Writing over the camera is a challenge. I still wasn't happy with how the color was looking, so I went to my Tomo River paper and tried to do some writing to give you an idea of the size of the lines. Here's a calibration stencil that I have, and here we are in millimeters. So you can see how wide that one line is. It's 1, 2, 3, almost 4 millimeters. So it's a lot bigger than what I originally had thought. So I have to admit that that's impressive to go from 0.2 to 4 millimeters. And you can also write very small with this very fine nib, or large. Hopefully this is a little bit more indicative of the color, but it's still gotten darker than I originally remember. Here's what the color looked like when I wrote with it with a different pen a few months ago. So I hope you've enjoyed. I haven't done a vintage for a while, so when I came across this pen in my box, I said, let's bring this pen into working order. So I'm grateful that I was able to do that. So thank you for watching. May you have many great, wonderful, incredible writing experiences. So we've reached the end of this video, and I'm enjoying this pen. I'm going to be writing a lot of letters with it until it may or may not find a new home. So until we meet again, bye for now. Enjoy your pens. I will enjoy this one.